Hi, I'm Brian Upton, and I'm here to talk about non-interactive play, which is a particular interest of mine. People react oddly when I say non-interactive play because we have such a strong association between interactivity and play that it seems strange to even bring up non-interactive play. But I think the fact that we associate play with interactivity is more of a historical accident than something that is really true of the fundamental nature of play. In order to explain this, I'm going to give a little bit of background. Games themselves are very, very old. If we look back in the historical record, we can find board games that people were playing in 4000 BC, the Royal Game of Ur, for example. And these old games are still entirely playable by us now. In fact, we were very lucky. We discovered the rules to the Royal Game of Ur on a cuneiform tablet, and we can actually play it now, and it's still a really fun game. But even though games are very, very old for humanity, they haven't been theorized very much. If we look at the history of game writing, it's almost all like, oh, here are the rules, or here's how to succeed at a game. We don't have any old game texts, game design texts, which is kind of odd when you think about it, because if you look at literature, literature has a long history of literary criticism. So going back to Aristotle in the Western tradition, we have several thousand years of people talking about just not what a story is, but what it means to write a story, what it means to read a story. How do we experience stories? This is what you learn if you learn about English literature, not just what all the stories are. But games are very, very different. Games, they're mostly created in a folk tradition, and there hasn't been a lot of theorizing for what is a game until recently. All of this changed in the 90s, of course, when it became big business, and all of a sudden it becomes really important to know how to make a game. There's a lot of money to be made if you make a game properly, and there's a lot of money to be made if a game is really good. So we start first seeing real game criticism only at the end of the 20th century. And at the time, we wound up with this sort of weird thing where we have like a very old art form that has almost nothing written about it in terms of how it operates critically. And so as a result, people look to other critical schools to think, what we should do here? What should we do here? How should we design games to be not just entertaining and profitable, but also forms of art? And this is the sort of what you've probably heard of the narratology, ludology debates. You have people on the game side saying, well, I'm designing games, and people on the narratology side saying, well, we have this critical theory. Why don't we bring it in and see if it works? And narratology literary theory does say some interesting things about what happens when you play a game and how you experience it. But the problem is that if you design games, you realize that they don't work the way stories do. There's all sorts of weird things that happen that literary theory doesn't really address. And so there's a strong pushback. We'd all just said, no, we're designing systems here. We're not designing these sort of linear, non-interactive experiences. And there's a real concerted effort to prevent the colonization of games by literature studies. And one strong weapon that was used to prevent this colonization was the notion of interactivity. Like, we're interactive, we do things differently, and that changes the game. There is no way all of this literary theory applies because interactivity changes how games work and how we interact with them. And this is true in a way. I mean, there are things that are unique about games, just as there are things in cinema that make it different from theater, and there's things in dance that make it different from painting. Every art form has its own unique things that make it function differently. Interactivity is a thing that games can do, but this emphasis on interactivity over everything else, making it sort of the core of what defines games, wound up sort of warping how we think of game design. And I think there's a lot of things that we have overlooked or missed as a result. A lot of things that have handicapped us as designers because of the centrality that interactivity has assumed within the games and the way people think about games. And the example I always use for this, to get people to think about why this is so, if you watch people play chess, when people play chess, they may spend 2 or 3 minutes not interacting with the game. They're just going to sit there and stare at the board. But when you're actually playing chess, the fact that you're only interacting once every few minutes doesn't make it less of a game. You don't feel as though the play is punctuated or intermittent. There's a continuous feeling of play as you play chess, even though the interaction is very sporadic. And if you look at other games, there are a whole variety of experiences where it doesn't matter so much to be constantly interacting with the game. So a great example are horror games. A lot of times horror games are very minimally interactive. You're creeping around someplace that's dark and scary. You're worried that something's going to jump out at you. You're interacting a little and that you're moving and you're looking, but you're not you're not fighting, you're not pushing back against things. A lot of the experience of a horror game comes from the lack of interactivity, the fact that you're denied the opportunity to have agency in the world, and that adds to your feeling of helplessness and the power of the horror game. Horror games are just one example. We also have puzzle games. A lot of times, if you're playing a puzzle game, what you wind up doing is, just like with chess, sitting and staring for a long period of time. I recently played The Witness, and if you play The Witness, you discover you spend a lot of time just sort of staring at the screen, not just how do I solve this puzzle, but what is the puzzle here that I'm supposed to solve? And it's very engaging, it's very deep, and it's very powerful, even though you're not constantly interacting with the game. And what turns out that if you really look at spaces like this, there are heuristics we can use for designing these kinds of spaces. One of the problems of ignoring non-interactive play is that we don't theorize non-interactive play. We don't think, oh, what are the design principles of designing a good non-interactive play space, because it's rendered largely invisible. So a lot of my work has been to try to uncover these. This all started when I was the lead designer on the original Rainbow Six, and it turns out that the original Rainbow Six has a lot of really interesting non-interactive play moments. If you haven't played it, it's a tactical shooter. This is back in the 90s, so the graphics are very, very primitive. But you spend a lot of time sneaking around, worried about where the enemy is. Is there a terrorist around the next corner? Are they waiting to ambush me? Where are the hostages located? And one of the things we discovered is that some of the most fun gameplay in Rainbow Six occurs when you're not shooting anything. It's when you're crouched in a hallway wondering if there's something around the next corner. And so I spent a lot of time trying to figure out, what makes it fun to be crouched in a hallway? Why are some hallways fun to crouch in and other ones are boring? What situations can we use to set up these sort of interesting non-interactive play spaces? And now, almost 20 years later, I'm still working on it. I've written a book in the meantime, but I've spent a lot of time thinking about what actually goes on when we're not interacting with the game. So for the rest of this talk, I'm just going to talk about some of the principles that are involved in designing non-interactive play spaces. One of the most important ones is simply to what I call stillness, that you have to create space for non-interactive play to unfold. Because of the emphasis on interactivity, we often think that we need to keep the player busy. We need to always be providing new things for the player to do, new challenges. And sometimes the best thing you can do is just let the game hold still for a while. Sometimes this happens a lot, like right after a big boss battle. You'll fight a big boss. It's very exciting. It's very intense. And then it's really nice if the game just kind of settles down and lets you recover from it. And it's not just a matter of pacing. It's that you also need time to kind of unwind and process what just happened, particularly if what just happened is significant in some way to the story, to your strategic understanding of the game. So part of what is behind non-interactive play is simply designing moments when you're not interacting and understanding why that moment is there. What are you asking the player to do in that moment, and why are you pulling back from interactivity at that moment to give them something to do? When you're thinking about what players are doing in that moment, a lot of times what you want to be thinking about is ambiguity. What sort of ambiguities are you asking them to resolve? And this is sort of the next thing. And once you provide the stillness, then what occupies the stillness? The stillness is occupied by an ambiguity. One way to think about it is what question is the player asking themselves when the ambiguity is unfolding? What are they thinking about at a given time? And if it's a puzzle game, the answer is really obvious. If you're creating a moment of stillness in the puzzle game, you're expecting the player to think in their heads through all the different possibilities for how they can resolve the puzzle. If you're doing a strategic game, then the moment of stillness is, what lies around the next corner? What should my plan be? How can what should I be doing next in the game? But if you're designing a horror game, then your moment of stillness might be filled entirely with apprehension. Again, it's what's around the next corner, but it's not making a plan in order to combat it. You're worrying about it. You're anxious. That the construction of an ambiguity that is then filled by your worst imaginings is what you're going for in a non-interactive horror game space. And if you're doing something that is artistic, if you're doing something that's like a walking simulator or a game that's supposed to have a deep meaning to people, then the ambiguity you may be creating is why am I doing this game? Why am I playing this game? What does this game mean? What is this game trying to tell me? There's a lot of questions that you can ask yourself beyond just the moment-to-moment, how do I succeed in the game, that are interesting to grapple with if you have the stillness in which to grapple with it. So the first thing to do when you create an ambiguity is to think, what question are you asking? And then thinking, what are the possible answers that the player might come up with. You want a handful of answers. If it's completely wide open, players can't get confused. If it's a really very simple question, they'll answer it quickly, and then it's all over. So you want to have the sense of that there are a sort of fruitful ambiguity that can you have to chew on for a little bit in order to resolve things. Now, in terms of, in order for something to be fruitful that you can work with for a while, there are a couple of things. First of all, they can't repeat. Once you resolve an ambiguity, it's played out. If you're crouched in a corner saying, well, what's around the next corner? And you say, I think there's a dragon around the next corner. Well, then you're done. You're done with that sort of non-interactive play, and you move on. So what's particularly interesting is games that tease you with an ongoing chain of ambiguities. So like, I think there's a dragon around the next corner, but what do I do? Dragons are really tough. What do I have in my inventory? Well, there's something over there. Maybe if I add that to my inventory, that'll help me. The sense that there is this constant rolling ambiguity, these different attempts to strategize you're constantly cycling through. And this works also when you're doing interpretive play, where you're trying to figure out what does something mean. If you think about, why is this character performing this action? Why is she acting like that? Is she really trying to betray me? But if she betrays me, what is her relation? Once you start adding up all these different ambiguities, they begin to they chain together with each other and generate new questions for you to ask yourself. And so it's not just having one question; it's having a chain of questions that continue to build and grow on top of each other. The additional thing you need to have is that when you resolve them, they should never quite resolve themselves. You want to have a reason to continue to come back and revisit them. Like, I think I know what the answer is, but as I get new bits of information, well, maybe I really don't. Maybe I was mistaken. The final point I add is that when you think about resolving ambiguities, we tend to think in terms of winning in games, in terms of like, I got the right answer. So, for example, if you're doing a puzzle game, clearly the way you're going to resolve your non-interactive play is to come up with the answer. Okay, I solved it. Yes, done. But a lot of times the more interesting artistic games, the answers are not so simple. You don't want them saying, okay, yeah, I know exactly what this means. I've solved the puzzle of meaning of the game. Now I'm done. And so rather than thinking in terms of having an explicit puzzle you're trying to solve with these non-interactive play spaces, it's often more useful to think about your goals in terms of our more intrinsic motivations. And there's three particular intrinsic motivations I think are really, really useful. The first one is what I call coherence, and coherence is playing a role. So, for example, if you're, we're all familiar with this because we did it a lot as kids. When you play make-believe, you're engaged in coherence play. And in coherence play, you're not trying to pick a move or an interpretation that makes you win. You're trying to do something that satisfies your sense that you're doing it right. Yeah, I'm pretending to be a fireman. I'm pretending to be a fireman correctly because I am squirting water on flower bushes. This sort of sense of getting it right becomes, or coherence play becomes a big motivator when we're looking at non-interactive play spaces. Because if we're trying to imagine who a character is or what's going on in the world, we want to have everything hang together in a way and figuring out, like, why would she be doing that? Because she's going to betray me. That's a moment of coherence play. The character snaps into view. We understand why what their motivations are and why they're acting the way they're acting. And that's very, very satisfying, even though we haven't actually won. We're not sure that's the correct solution, but it feels right because it coheres. The other motivations are expansion and closure, and they contrast with each other. Early on in a game, we try to come up with things that expand our possible play space. So if you're doing non-interactive play, you're not interested in necessarily figuring something out. You're necessarily interested in sort of expanding the possibilities of the world. And so this is the the gameplay we experience when we wonder what if, what would happen if we all grouped together and attacked that way. That's an interesting thing to think about. So the fun of running through all the different possibilities, of exploring all the different nooks and crannies of what's possible, that's enjoyable in itself, even if you don't ever come up with what you feel is the right answer. It's running through all the different changes of the possibility space that makes it interesting. On the other side of the coin, as we reach the end of a game, we want to try to shut things down. The example I always use is in Pokemon, Gotta Catch 'Em All. In a lot of games, we have things where we try to close down the possibility space, collect everything, resolve everything. And we talk about non-interactive play. This often involves coming up with closure. So a sense of like, oh yeah, I know why that happened. It's because we were all working against the rebellion, but the rebellion turned out to be evil. I have an explanation. And so the sense of arriving at explanations, of shutting down the possibilities, of resolving everything is also extremely satisfying. Again, it doesn't have to be the right answer. It just has to be an answer that feels like it shuts down the possibility space that we're playing within. So this gives you sort of a basic idea of like, so what the outlines of this kind of play is like. You create moments of ambiguity, they chain together, you give people a way to resolve them. That doesn't necessarily mean you're getting them right, but that satisfies their sense of everything cohering, or everything expanding, or everything closing off. And what's interesting about all of this is because it ties very closely in with the way we experience stories. And one of the things I find so exciting about it is that there's often this sort of sense that that gameplay and story play are two very different things. That it's like games are treated, with stories are treated as like this two-headed beast, and you have to serve each one independently. But if you look at games that really tightly integrate game and story, you can use your gameplay constraints, your rules, as a way to tell a story, and you can use what's happening in the story as a way to influence what you think within the game. And it's much easier to do if you think about play as not simply being interacting and not simply being about winning. If you can identify the non-interactive moments of play when you're within a normal gameplay situation, then it becomes a lot easier to think about how that gradually elides into non-interactive play in a storytelling situation, that the two can flow back and forth between each other, and you're not limited to one single way of thinking about how a game has to be played. In closing, there are a couple of things I want to say. First, I spoke at the very beginning that interactivity was invented as a defense for preventing literature from or literary studies from colonizing game design. I think actually that if we think about non-interactive play and the way play operates, we actually have a really interesting opportunity for game design to colonize literature. I think there's a lot of things that happen within literature, a lot of things that we know within literary theory that we don't really have explanations for, that are potentially explainable by thinking about the ludic function of play within the act of reading or watching a normal narrative. I think there are a lot of things that happen in narratives that are kind of strange, but that make perfect sense if you think about them as play spaces. The other thing is that it's been suggested that I give kind of an activity, a way that you can sort of experience this yourself. There are a couple of games that I'd recommend that are particularly good at showing this off. One of them is Portal. A lot of people have played Portal. What's interesting about Portal is that it has both really strong puzzles and a really strong narrative sense. And so if you play through Portal, pay attention to what you're doing when you're holding still, when you're not actually like moving the shooting, firing portals, but when you're just sort of staring at the game. What are you experiencing? And particularly pay attention to how that non-interactive puzzle solving experience is affected by GLaDOS, your antagonist in the game, who is talking to you through the whole thing. There's a story that's unfolding. The story intersects with the puzzles, and a lot of what happens that's meaningful occurs as you're thinking about what's happening rather than doing the things you've been asked to do. The other example that I give, which is a little harder to come by, unfortunately, because it was pulled off the store, the PlayStation Store, is PT, the playable trailer for Silent Hills. It's a really wonderful horror game. It's kind of amazing because it is minimally interactive. There is very little you can do in the game other than walk around and stare at things. But at the same time, it happens to be really, really, really scary. And a lot of what it does is by building a really powerful sense of apprehension. There are these moments where, if you haven't played the game, it takes place in an L-shaped corridor that you revisit over and over again. And every time you exit the corridor, you're sort of like thrust back into the beginning of the corridor again. And a lot of the horror involves walking down this corridor to where the corner is and dreading what's around that corner. And you dread that same corner over and over and over again. So even if you don't get a chance to play PT, because it's hard to get a hold of right now, actually watching a walkthrough of PT can also be very effective, because you can get a sense of the way the space itself structures the non-interactive play that emerges as you just walk through it. If you want to read more about this, I have a book out about all this called The Aesthetic of Play, which is available from MIT Press. I also just finished another book, which is, I actually just sent off all the proofs for it today, called Situational Game Design, which is a more practical guide to all this. But unfortunately, unless you're watching this a year from now, it's probably not available yet. So thanks very much. I'm Brian Upton. If you want to find me online, I'm at @BBUpton on Twitter. I'm fairly active there. I'd love to talk about this more if you have any thoughts, because I love non-interactive playtests. Thanks.